As you probably know, a lot happened in the last 48 hours with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, America and Ukraine. At first glance, it doesn't make sense. Trump, the supposed consummate deal maker, along with his brand new defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, did the surely less than genius thing of announcing concessions to Putin before negotiations had even begun. And that's right, that wouldn't make sense. The mainstream media has been making that point and then moving on, rather than asking, so what's actually going on? What we've seen in recent weeks is that Trump has been preceding any negotiation or discussion by hurling some ridiculously extreme position or claim, forcing his opposite number in the forthcoming negotiation to respond to a shift in reality in terms of what's being negotiated for. And yet this seems to be the exact opposite, unless you realise what would be intuitively obvious to those commentators if they weren't obsessed with their place on the pro-Trump, anti-Trump spectrum, which is that when Trump negotiates with Putin, he will be negotiating on behalf of Trump and his vision for America, not on behalf of Ukraine. So that leaves you then to go back to basics and ask the question, what is Trump going to want from Putin in return for him organising optimal conditions for the end of the war with Ukraine? So far, I haven't seen anyone else talking about this, but there are some things, so let's discuss. First of all, let's just get up to speed on what's been happening. Trump announced that he had spoken with Vladimir Putin on a call that he suggested was the opening of talks to end the Ukraine war. This in itself is remarkable, fact that did not escape the rest of the world. The war is, after all, between Russia and Ukraine. But Ukraine was not included on the call. The call reportedly was lengthy and, quote, highly productive, no details of which were forthcoming. The conversation came after Russia agreed to a prisoner swap deal, where an imprisoned American teacher would be released in exchange for a convicted Russian cybercriminal. It also came just after Trump's new Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made a speech where he said that Ukraine joining NATO was off the table and that the US would no longer prioritise European security. And he added that any security guarantees offered to Ukraine must be based on European, or in any case not American, troops. To be clear, he said, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be US troops deployed to Ukraine. Trump separately agreed that joining NATO was not practical for Ukraine. CNN reported one European defence official saying that while many in NATO don't necessarily believe Ukraine could join the alliance, given current political realities, they also don't say so publicly, as the Americans now had done, because in so doing you signal to Russia that it can dictate who can and cannot join. The European fury at Trump's actions with Putin was not restricted to either side of the political spectrum. The former Conservative Defence Secretary, Sir Ben Wallace, writing in The Telegraph, said that if Trump was seen to capitulate to the Kremlin, it would be a repeat of Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler. Referring to the Munich Security Conference this weekend, he said, quote, Munich's motto is peace through dialogue, but it has proven itself in recent years to also be a forceful bastion of European resistance against Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. What a shame, then, that this year's gathering seems set to mirror the disastrous conference of 1938, where the continent stood blind in the face of Hitler's duplicity. The stench of appeasement is once again returning to Munich. After Chamberlain returned to Britain in 1938, having signed an agreement with Adolf Hitler, he proclaimed peace for our time. Winston Churchill then rebutted that you were given the choice between war and dishonour. You chose dishonour, and you will have war. This was echoed by Kaja Kallas, the EU's top diplomat. It is clear that any deal behind our backs will not work. You need the Europeans, you need the Ukrainians. Why are we giving them, i.e., Russia, everything that they want even before the negotiations had started? It's appeasement, she said. All of these responses have a strong element of truth in the world where negotiations are between Russia and Ukraine, with Ukraine's hand being strengthened by its allies standing firmly behind it. But that is not the negotiation that we're going to see. As always, I don't say these things because I prefer them to be true, just because I see evidence that they are true, and I prefer to deal with reality, not with wishful thinking. Trump is gearing up to negotiate with Putin, is already negotiating with Putin, and it is about what Putin wants and what Trump wants. Full stop. Ukraine is one of the pieces on the board to be played. It is, as the current terminology would have it, a non-player character in the negotiation about its own future. What Trump can offer Putin is the easiest question to answer because it's been foreshadowed in what has been said publicly. The US has the option to withdraw any and all of its support from Ukraine. Right now, Trump has been pushing Zelensky with the idea that future support will be in return for valuable minerals to be found on Ukraine's territory. A trade, in other words. That's more about Trump having a way that would be accepted by his own side for him to continue support should the deal not come off. Once he has shown that there's self-interest involved, that supporting Ukraine can be a great deal on essential minerals, that it can be about making America great, then MAGA loyalists will be happy. But it doesn't stop him, of course, from deciding not to do that and ending support tomorrow. Likewise, he can pull back sharply from involvement in Europe, or he could pull back only lightly, whilst encouraging them to step up. He can aggressively put pressure on Zelensky as soon as the war is over. Or he cannot. This week he made the passing comment, sometime Ukraine's going to have elections too. His poll numbers aren't particularly great, referring to Zelensky. On the extreme end, he could even pull out of NATO, effectively sealing the end of the alliance and fulfillment of one of Putin's fondest dreams. That would require some serious reciprocation, though. It's not clear that the negotiations to start soon are aiming for that massive a scale of change. I wouldn't necessarily count it out for the midterm future. But you might say that doesn't explain two things. One, what can Putin offer Trump? If it's not about concessions on Ukraine, then what is it? And two, why would he go into negotiations having already semi-offered concessions? What everyone's asking. It's been some years since I read The Art of the Deal, but I'm pretty sure I don't remember the chapter that said that that was a good idea. Well, let's deal with that second one first. Given Trump's behaviours to date, the logical thing to conclude is that this isn't a brash, challenging, opening position he's throwing at Putin, obviously, but it is a brash opening position he's throwing at Zelensky and the Europeans. It's their perception of reality he's seeking to change, to get them reconciled to a much greater acceptance of the sort of accommodations that would make Putin feel he has come out on top. Why, oh why would they say things like that in public? Wailed the Europeans and the Ukrainians. Precisely to make you shocked and alarmed in the way that you are, and therefore looking for compromises with this new harsh extreme possibility that Trump might completely give away everything. Trump is looking to create the circumstances where he can make an offer to Putin even when he's not wholly in control of the delivery of the promises that he makes. Putin has said many times that in his view, this conflict was always between Russia and America, and that therefore its conclusion would be negotiated between the two of them as two great powers deciding the fate of the smaller, quote, non-sovereign powers in play. Putin will therefore be delighted that this is now the vision for the end of this conflict that Trump is offering. And he is presumably offering it because, as we've seen with his recent actions with Gaza and with Greenland and even Canada, he is wholly bought into exactly this conception of a new world order. Some commentators have acknowledged as much, the new might makes right world, but they seem slow to apply this new lens on reality onto interpreting Trump's positions and actions from this point on. They still want to use the old lens. We may expect that the lengthy call with Putin went over a lot of territory, some of which will have been about Ukraine, some of which would not. And that brings us back to the first question. What does Putin have to offer that Trump actually wants? This is more speculative than my usual commentary on this channel, by necessity. But here we go. Yes, Trump wants to see the war end, but that's not even remotely at the centre of his ambitions. It could well be that he wants to agree with Putin that they recognise each other's right to exert their power in their respective spheres of influence. So far, for example, Russia has not expressed support for Trump's plan for Gaza, rather the opposite. Nobody quite knows whether Trump intends to literally follow through with his Gaza resort idea, or whether it was a harsh opening gambit to force the Arab states to step up with a plan of their own. Should it be the former? It's worth noting that Russia has good relations with Egypt and Jordan, the two countries that Trump needs to play ball by taking the Palestinians onto their territory, but who, for the reasons I discussed last week, have refused point blank. Egypt has long been dependent on Russian grain, amongst other things. Egyptian President Sisi's strategy has generally been to leverage support from both the United States and Russia, using each to counterbalance the other. Well, if Russia were to change its stance on Gaza and follow that up with quiet communications to Egypt that it was acting in concert with Trump on this specific matter, it would place intolerable pressure that, despite the almost existential consequences of giving in, might practically leave Egypt with little choice. There could be similar leverage with Jordan, but to be honest, it's Egypt, as the far bigger of the two, that is really the key player. If you think that might be part of the discussion, then it starts to make even more sense that Trump floated the idea of a summit meeting between the two of them, hosted by Saudi Arabia. Even if Trump's eyebrow-raising proposal was a provocation for others, Russia's influence with those others would still be an important asset in making it happen. So that could be one possible significant thing Putin could offer, along potentially with a relaxed attitude to Trump's pressure on Denmark and Greenland, whatever shape that may take in the coming period. After all, Trump picking a fight with a NATO member and with the rest of the EU, it's kind of good news for Putin anyway, if he values the diminution of European power more than he does the US getting what it wants in terms of access to resources and opening of trade routes. It's possible that Trump would go in with asks in relation as well to Putin's relationship with China. I doubt Russia would give anything on that, so there's no value particularly in exploring it here, but he might well try it. Other things that come out of all of this that delight Putin, of course, include the mere fact of these negotiations happening at all. The West has isolated Putin to a large degree. Trump will, at a stroke, rehabilitate his status as a player on the world stage to be dealt with. The normalization of Russia, and especially the end of international sanctions, would be a huge win for Putin. I generally assume that Trump will want an outcome that he will be able to present as good for Ukraine, not a betrayal of Ukraine, although some will undoubtedly label it as such. And probably correctly. Let's be clear about it. But therefore, if he can bully Zelensky and the EU into accepting current, or certainly only a minor variation on current boundaries, and to do so in return for various security guarantees that involve European forces, maybe significant armaments, then he will argue that this was necessary for peace. After all, this week he actually made the argument that it was unlikely Ukraine would get back much land, saying that Russia, quote, took a lot of land and they fought for that land and they lost a lot of soldiers, which is a pretty remarkable justification on the old rules. There remains an open question whether that would be enough for Putin, who to date has been reluctant to step back from his original maximalist war aims. We shouldn't assume that Putin will be any sort of pushover in these discussions, even though he should be attracted to the idea of playing the larger game. All right, but let's step back from the brutal might makes right logic of all of this and ask some of the morally obvious questions. Specifically, where does this realistically leave Zelensky and the nation of Ukraine? The Europeans are seeking to insert themselves back into the negotiating process to bolster their hand. Let's assume that they fail in any substantial way. A few token gestures will be offered, I expect, but they ultimately do not have leverage over Trump. So I can't see why he would accommodate them in the larger power play, to which he holds them as being broadly irrelevant. For Zelensky, there are a couple of possibilities left to him. One would be that the negotiations fail, clearly because of Putin's intransigence, and so America reluctantly pulls support back behind Ukraine, at least for now. The hope would be that once Putin had seen that he wasn't going to get the outcome he wanted just falling into his lap because of Trump, then he would have to do some adjusting to new realities of his own to be ready to make more concessions. Having had a more accommodating approach dangled in front of him, he might be more affected when it is then suddenly snatched away. Indeed, Ukraine may cleverly identify a wedge issue that would make it more likely. Zelensky might have some luck in charming and flattering Trump into a certain perception that makes it more likely. But if either of those comes off, we'll be looking back on it in the future and remarking how skillful negotiators the Ukrainians are. Because the odds, let's face it, are against it. So for Zelensky, it's going to have to be about either refusing to accept an outcome he had no part in negotiating, and then fighting on with just European support and zero American backing. Putin would be happy with that because he would presume that he would ultimately win on his own terms and probably on an accelerated timescale. Or Zelensky will have to focus on the conception of a security guarantee for the future that will actually hold real weight as a deterrent to future renewed Russian incursions. From where I sit, that means Western military boots on the ground and probably in significant numbers. And that's assuming that the will remains strong in Western European countries to play such a role, regardless of the outcomes of forthcoming elections. Note that J.D. Vance suggested at one point that any such European military presence would not be covered by Article 5 of NATO, meaning the US would not feel it was under an obligation should it come under attack. What view does China make of any of this? China had toyed at one point with the idea of being the peace broker who brought the two sides together, and it then backed off from that, presumably because its early discussions with Putin found him unwilling to grant them such a role before he had made more of the progress that he'd wanted to make on the battlefield. They will watch a summit in Saudi Arabia with some regrets, not least because they know that Trump wants to pull resources from Europe, precisely so he can give China much more of his attention. It would be interesting to know, although I doubt we ever will, how much and in what way China might seek to influence Putin's negotiations with Trump on the non-Ukraine portion of the agenda, because one presumes that they will be having some reasonably detailed discussions on the matter. What's coming next may be nothing less than a return to the Yalta Conference dynamic, where the great leaders met in 1945 to carve up the post-war world. Probably be less in the open, but potentially even more profound in how it will set the rules and expectations for the coming decades. That's assuming Trump plays his hand well, which is unproven since nothing on this scale was even attempted in his first term. Noting that Trump has a strategy isn't the same as saying that what he's seeking to achieve is within his powers, or indeed that it would be morally defensible in its outcome. Those things remain to be seen. Anyway, that's how it looks to me. Agree? Disagree? Let me know your own thoughts in the comments below.